Hey, it's syndicated radio talk show host, author, singer Al Cole, welcoming you to another edition of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. I come from CBS Radio. My shows are nationally syndicated through Apple's iTunes radio network under their professional news talk division, airing CBS shows and NPR, BBC, Fox News, a whole kit and caboodle, C-SPAN as well. So I get beautiful coverage for all of my guests all across the country and around the world as well. And, I also have my media consulting that I do for people if they want to learn how to be even more successful on talk shows that they're going to be on and media in general. And, you can email me for all of this stuff and my People of Distinction humanitarian awards, everything that I do, voiceover work. You can email me at alcoholic@gmail.com. You heard me right. That's ALCOLEHOLIC@gmail.com. And I really want to thank my CBS radio listeners for coming up with that handle, Alcoholic. Seemed like from day one my listeners have been saying, Al, we love what you're doing there, brother. In fact, we're hooked on it. We're alcoholics. And I'm also a New York Times best-selling author with Chicken Soup for the Soul. Chicken Soup for the Soul is distributed by CBS's Simon & Schuster. So we keep it in the family that way. Coming up, a guy who's helping a lot of families here. His name is Richard Roach. And he's an author, and this guy is really amazing. He's written a book called Rings of Annulment. Okay, now, somebody's going to ask, Al, boy, it's a gripping title, but what does it mean? Well, we know about rings, and particularly maybe wedding rings. Yeah, all right, so maybe we're on course right there. Annulment, we understand that word, to cancel out something. Particularly maybe a wedding. Maybe two people are married, and then before even divorce proceedings, well, they just have it annulled. Maybe it's a few days, maybe it's a week, or something like that. We've heard of that. Now, we've also heard of this, abuse. And sometimes husbands, they lay it on the wives a little bit too much. They abuse the person that they say that they love. And then that person maybe has to call for an annulment or something. This book is about a waitress who is abused by her own husband. We know of the Me Too movement and so many women coming out of the closet and saying, I was abused by this person, that person. And of course, it's a man who abused them in most cases. We can't have that in our society. And Richard's going to tell us some of the reasons we can't through Rings of Annulment. He's also going to tell us a little bit about another book that he's written. He's written a whole bunch of books. Another one is Never a Woman. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it's about African women who refuse female genital mutilation. Now, I want you to get onto that one, people. What does it mean? It means, we know about, come on, we're adults here, we know about the female genital area. And we also know that there's a certain area of the female genitalia that has to do with pleasure. And if we remove a little bit of the pleasure aspects there, the clitoris, and females don't feel the pleasure as much, maybe some men think that, well, they're not going to run around with anybody else, and I can have that woman all to myself all through my life. That's very unfair. And unfair is just the beginning of it. I mean, it's really catastrophic for so many women, in Africa particularly. I'm not coming down on Africa. I'm an African man myself. I'm coming down on female genital mutilation, and so is Richard. And I want you to stick around because he has some things to say that are going to be so gripping to you and educational as well. And Richard was brought to my show by his book publisher, UR-Link Publishing. And UR-Link is one of the greatest cutting-edge book publishers in the country, concentrating on that personal touch to their authors. And, hey, if you want to get a step closer to your best-selling book aspirations, well, you got to run to this website, urlinkpublishing.com. And I want you to run to Richard's website, too, to order Richard's books. Go to savingskunk.com. Welcome, Richard, to People of Distinction with Al Cole. It's a pleasure to have you on today. How are you, Richard?
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
And it's an opportunity on both ends. It's an opportunity for my listeners through Apple and all around the country, around the world, to hear what you have to say about abuse of both varieties in your book, Rings of Annulment and Never a Woman. Let's start out with Rings of Annulment.
Rings of Annulment is about a young woman who is abused by her husband. In fact, he burns up her clothes. So she decides to take her backpack and she starts hitchhiking. She ends up in a little town called Cotton, Minnesota, where there's a restaurant and there is a little store, but nobody lives in Cotton, Minnesota. So she ends up working as a waitress there, and over the course of the novel, she interfaces everybody that stops by, the truckers, the school children, the Minnesota Department of Transportation people who stop at the restaurant, and she changes all of their lives. So that is what the novel is about, and then how they in turn change the community that she serves.
Isn't it something? If we could have that inspiration going out to all of our communities, not just the one that you're mentioning, but all of our communities around the country, even parts of the world, we could help to change our human family elevation even higher and higher and higher. Now, give us some insight here, Richard. Very few people are going to write a novel about something that they know just a little bit about. They're really going to write about some of their passion set, maybe personally, certain things that they really are engaged in. And in your case, helping to end abuse within the family life between a man and a woman. Do you do that sort of work in general? Maybe you're involved in certain activities that way, certain organizations that are helping to lessen abuse in our society?
Yes, I'm a physician working for Western Michigan University, and as a result, I have contact with lots of women who are struggling with their relationships. We have 3 full-time social workers that work with our clinic, so I'm very familiar with the kinds of struggles that the character in my book deals with. In addition, Cotton, Minnesota is where I lived when my father lost his job, and we were homeless, and a family in Cotton, Minnesota invited us to come and live with their family. So this little town in northern Minnesota is near and dear to my heart.
Isn't that something? And I like Minnesota. I've traveled all around the country and parts of the world, and Minnesota is one of the places that I've really liked. It's homey, and I like that area. I'm Wisconsin, the Great Lakes, and Minnesota is a little bit more to the west. A lot of people who are down to earth, and so, hey, we're getting along here on People of Distinction with Al Cole. And people, if you like it too, run to this website, order this great book, Rings of Annulment, by our guest, Richard Roach, here on People of Distinction with Al Cole. Go to savingskunk.com. And now, Richard, before we get into more of Rings of Annulment and then go into Never a Woman and any other books that you want to put some feature on, tell us about this website. We wouldn't expect, even though it's alliterative and we like that, we wouldn't expect that particular verbiage here, Saving Skunk. Where did that come from?
Saving Skunk website is based on my first novel, Saving Skunk, which is about a young woman in Minnesota. She's a Ojibwe Indian, and she wants to go to medical school. So the tribe says, well, we'll pay for you, but you have to become a medicine woman first and go through the rituals of becoming a medicine woman or a Medewin. So that was my first novel, is based on some Native American friends that I had who told me stories. So I conglomerized all of their stories and put it into a novel. So since that was my first book, my website is named after Saving Skunk.
We get it. And, it's a great story there. Now, let's move from Rings of Annulment, the waitress who was abused by her husband. You gave us the wonderful rundown there in terms of what it really means to be abused by one's own husband, and also a lot of your pathways in life, some personal things that you mentioned too, being an educator, a physician, and somebody who understands a woman's body. And we're going to talk about that too, in Never a Woman, an African woman who refuses female genital mutilation to her body. Tell us how you came up with that one and what the special interest is of you in that area, especially African women.
Yes, I have worked in Rwanda and Kenya and Sierra Leone, as well as Madagascar. And as a physician, I've had the opportunity to meet many women who have had female genital mutilation. I've assisted on the surgeries to repair them because they often get a fistula tract between their bladder and their vagina, so urine comes out their vagina. The husband often rejects them because of this. So what we've done is repaired these women. In the process, I had the opportunity to interview them, find out what their life was like. And so when I wrote this book, it is about a young girl who absolutely refuses to be mutilated. And so then her whole tribe rejects her. Her uncle burns her house down, and she's off on an adventure to try to stay alive. And so that's why she's called Never a Woman, because her uncle says, without having female genital mutilation, you will never become a real woman.
Is that the line that they sometimes use? How do they justify that line? Without female genital mutilation, you will never become a full woman. How do they convince women of that?
It's part of the puberty rites. So you're just a girl until you go through puberty rites. And the Kisi tribe, Kisii, the Kisi tribe that I wrote about, their tribal rules say that unless you go through this ritual, then you can't really be a woman and you can never be married. So when she refuses, that means that she can't ever get married to anyone in the tribe, and so she is isolated and rejected because of that.
Isn't that something? Ostracized. Now, the men don't call it female genital mutilation. They don't use that term mutilation. They might say enhancement or something that sounds positive. What is the term that African men in that area would use in place of female genital mutilation, Richard?
Oftentimes it's just called female circumcision. And there are several varieties of that because I've been involved in helping to repair these women. So I know about all the different varieties of but it's just called female circumcision by a lot of the tribes.
That's right. And a growing amount, I would think, of African women are refusing that procedure. About my listeners like ballpark percentages. It just gets them in line with what might be going on just generally. About what percent of the African population that you're talking about of women are starting to refuse this female genital mutilation process, would you think? Ballpark.
Well, it depends on the tribe.
Yep.
So Kisi tribe is still very much involved in doing female circumcision, whereas the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya doesn't do that at all. And in fact, some of the coastal tribes in Kenya also think it is a barbaric procedure. So you can see even in a country like Kenya, there is a lot of diversity of opinion about whether it is important for a woman to have this procedure or not.
That's right. And is it a legal procedure as well with a lot of the African tribes, or is it just ritual?
In Kenya, it's actually been declared illegal, but that doesn't prevent various tribes from continuing to practice it.
It's brutality of another sort, and Richard talks about that. Of course, in his book, Rings of Annulment, a waitress who is abused by her husband, that sort of brutality within the family structure, and another sort of brutality not necessarily in the United States, but in Africa, and maybe not even exclusive to just Africa, but particularly Africa. We know about women who are undergoing day by day female genital mutilation that Richard is talking about in Never Woman. I want you to order both of these great books and all the wonderful books of our guest here on People of Distinction with Al Cole, Richard Roach, and you can order them at his wonderful website, savingskunk.com. Again, that's savingskunk.com. Richard, I want to ask you a question that kind of like a possibility question here that maybe you haven't been asked before, maybe you have. Now, this is of special interest to my listeners. I like to go into possibility thinking sometimes. So with Never Woman particularly, the African women who are refusing female genital mutilation, let's say that they succeed. And that maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, maybe next week, if we're really lucky, all of a sudden, in Africa anyway, the areas that you're talking about, there's no more female genital mutilation. What kind of difference would that make to the population, the culture of Africa, and maybe around the world? Tell us what some of the ramifications, the positive ramifications of that might be.
I've mostly worked in sub-Saharan Africa, and in that area, it would mean that that would not necessarily be part of puberty rights. Some African tribes have actually changed their puberty rights so that it doesn't include that. So that's the kind of change it would make. More importantly, in terms of fertility, what happens with these women is that they have a very difficult labor, and the reason that they get fistulas from their bladder is because the head of the baby literally necroses the tissue between the vagina and the bladder. That's how they end up leaking urine. Well, if they're not doing this procedure, then delivery is less traumatic, and these women are not going to be having problems with bladder fistulas, and they're going to have much healthier babies. Many of the babies end up dying because the labor lasts so long that the baby dies in the process of delivery.
Wow. That is some great focus that you're entering into. And I'm going to take that ball and run with it with a quick reflection of my own that I make periodically on People of Distinction with Al Cole. This is my reflection. This goes out to you, my listening audience right now, my people. Richard mentioned that if we didn't have female genital mutilation, we might have healthier children. Okay, so that might be one of the results. Now, what's wrong with that, people? We all want health. We all want happiness in our world. So if we're going to pass it on to the next generation, our children, that is the least that we can do for our children, and then our grandchildren, and our grandchildren's grandchildren. How do you think we got here in the first place? We were brought in by our parents, who were brought in by their parents, and it just goes back to the dawn of history. We need to focus on some of the other generations as well, future generations and their well-being. There's another aspect to this, too. There are probably 1,000 other aspects, but I'm going to mention another one. If we didn't have female genital mutilation in our society, in Africa particularly, but all over the society, in any way that you now want to redefine mutilation, abuse, or whatever, we would have, as men, and I'm talking about men right now particularly, more respect for the women in our lives. Now, what's wrong with that? Respect is something that now leads to real friendship, real relationships, where we can talk with one another, where we can communicate positively to one another, and we can say, hey, honey, I'm having this problem. Maybe you can help me out with it. Whoa. Now, get that. Yes, females have a beautiful sense of helping out as well. They have a mind just like men have a mind. We need to respect the intellect of our women as well as wanting their bodies. It's really cut and dry that way, people, in many cases. When we respect the intellect of a human being as well as maybe what they can give us in terms of gratification, now they're giving us so much more. They are now being some of our guides in life, and friendship is a big part of that. Love and friendship go together, and one of the nexus of all of this is love and, respect. Get it, people. We need to respect each other more, and especially in our family relationships, and lover to lover and husband to wife. Am I making some sense there, Richard?
Yes. In fact, the main character in that book, her name is Kwamboka, and Kwamboka ends up going to Nairobi University and excelling academically. So that fits right in with what you're saying, because she's rejected by her tribe. Then she has to find another focus, and her focus is to excel intellectually and become anthropologist or sociologist in the story.
Absolutely. Let's go back for a moment to Rings of Annulment to give that a full circle of understanding. You're talking, of course, in a novel. It's fictional, but it relates to real life out there. A waitress who was abused by her husband. The Me Too movement, I'm not saying that you're necessarily a part of the Me Too movement, but you're aware of it. It brings into focus the general aspect of women who have been abused and are being abused by men in their life. With Rings of Annulment, if you wanted to put it in the non-fictional sense, how prevalent do you think abuse might be in our society that way, with husbands abusing their wives, whether they're waitress wives or not waitress wives? How prevalent is that in your experience in our world?
I work in a clinic run by Western Michigan University, and we see a number of women in our clinic every day who have been abandoned by their husbands or divorced by their husbands, and they're living alone. They're trying to compensate for trying to get a job, trying to raise their children. So this is a very common and prevalent problem. In the novel, Rings of Annulment, the main character, Rebecca, ends up adopting a Native American family and nurturing the children of her fellow waitress. showing her the qualities that her children has, whereas the fellow waitress thinks of her children as somewhat obnoxious and problematic, and Rebecca heals that relationship with the other waitress's children. So I think that's a really important part in our society, is that we need healers. We need people that can bring relationships back together.
We certainly do. And again, if you're in agreement with that, people, and I know you must be, you're listening to People of Distinction with Alco, where we talk this way, I want you to run that way to that website that you can order both of these wonderful books at, and that is savingskunk.com. Richard Roach, our special guest here today, on People of Distinction with Alco, Rings of Annulment, Never a Woman. We love both of those books. We're coming down to the final minutes of the show, Richard, and I want to take it out with another possibility avenue here for our society here in the United States, particularly with abuse by husbands towards their wives, that you delineate in Rings of Annulment. Possibility thinking, in the same way that I asked it some minutes ago about African women, if they succeed, that there's no more female genital mutilation, and you gave us the answers that way. If we succeed in this country, possibility thinking, what sorts of differences would we see immediately in our society if there were no more domestic abuse? Well, let's just wipe it out. It doesn't have to be there. It's not God decreed. What would be the result of no more domestic abuse in the American society anyway? Richard, what do you think?
In the story of Rings of Annulment, Rebecca has great insight into healing truck drivers' relationships with their wives. She is very valuable in terms of developing a relationship with a grieving husband. Certainly, she makes an environment of safety for the other characters in the book. Respect and appreciation for teenagers is mentioned. And this is all part of listening. She's just a waitress. And yet, because she listens so positively to the customers that come to the restaurant, that's what changes people's lives.
It really does. It really does. And I'm going to make a final reflection here in the final minutes of this wonderful interview that we've been having with Richard Roach. And I'm going to put it my way, add my 2 cents to really the great wisdom and sense that Richard is making in what I'm calling possibility thinking right now, and has been making throughout the show. Everybody has a mommy and daddy. And this goes out to you, again, my listening audience. You came from a mommy and daddy. All right. Maybe you don't call it that. Mom and dad, or mother, father, whatever. And if we value the love that our mother and father, our mommy and daddy, gave to us, and we try to live that way, let's say that that's one of our value structures. Would this go against the teachings of love of my mommy and daddy? Now, if we didn't have any more abuse in our society between the mommy and daddy, then all of a sudden the children of those mommies and daddies would say, I respect my mommy and daddy. I respect the love that my father shows for my mother, and that, of course, my mother shows for my father. See, children learn from example. We know that. That's nothing new. And if we, as adults, and particularly within that marital bond, the husband and wife, if we as men as husbands, show our women, the wives, respect and love in front of the children, guess what? Those children are going to grab it on, they're going to run with it, and they're going to say, wow, now I'm learning without having to be lectured by my mommy and daddy. I'm learning through example. Now they are going out into the world, and they are expositors of that beautiful love as well. And they're going to reject things that go against that love. Now they have that value judgment, that monitor to say, my mommy and daddy taught me the good love to now go into the world and prosper with that beautiful love and go and propagate that beautiful love within everybody that I meet. And it doesn't have to be that you're lecturing to people. It's just maybe that glow that you're showing, and people are going to say, wow, you're a wonderful person. Yes, because I came from a wonderful mommy and daddy. So please, men particularly, but the women too, treat your significant other, your husband, your wife, whatever, with love and particularly respect. And we can grow this human society into something that we can really respect on the outside as well. And we won't have half of the contentiousness that we have in today's society. Learn from being a great mommy and daddy to your children, and also honor the mommy and daddy from whence you came and all the love that they gave you or tried to give you, and pass that on to the other people around you, and we will have a better human family. And that's how we talk on People of Distinction with Al Cole, and that's how Richard Roach, our special guest here today, talks as well, through two of his wonderful books, Rings of Annulment and Never a Woman. And also you can see all of his books at savingskunk.com. And like I said at the beginning of the show, well, Richard was brought to me by his book publisher, one of the best in the country, UR-Link Publishing. And they got that cutting-edge thing going with their authors, and that real personal approach with their authors, too. You get what you need and really what you want with UR-Link Publishing. So if you want to get a step closer to that best-selling book aspirations, well, run to this website, urlinkpublishing.com. Thank you so much, Richard, for being my special guest here today on People of Distinction with Al Cole. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I enjoyed it. You had good questions, and it really brings out the values in my book.